Assalamu alaikum listeners, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm your host Tanzim, and today we've got a very special guest on the show. Dr. Uthman Badar is a student of the Islamic Sciences and Western Continental Philosophy, who received his Ph.D. in Philosophy from Western Sydney University in 2023. His research interests include secularism and religion, liberalism, political theory, and political theology. He's also a research operations manager and lead editor at the Ummatics Institute and an active member of the Muslim community in Sydney with some 2 decades of engagement in grassroots, activism, dawah, and apologetics. So, Assalamu alaikum, Uthman, and welcome back again to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum assalam. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, I mean, what's been interesting? I actually noticed a bit more active on Twitter now with all the situation, what's happening, in Palestine, and unfortunately, how a lot of tragedy in terms of the lives lost, and the Israel's actions, and I guess on a global front, the reaction that has ensued from the conflict. So, what has been your take in general, I guess, in terms of your time on Twitter and the sort of responses of what you're seeing?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest, the last month. Moving to Twitter was just a matter of a lot of people have realized that Meta is doing all sorts of unethical things in the background with shadow banning and whatnot. So there's just not that much reach. So I had a Twitter account. I've had a Twitter account for a while, but I wasn't using it for the last 5 years. I never got the full hang of it, to be honest, with Twitter and the lack of the small amount of characters you have to use, I suppose. But kind of forced to go there now, and it's been good. I'm getting the hang of it, and it's at Uthman B if anyone wants to follow. But I think more important than that, it's been a roller coaster of a month. It's been a very tough period, I think, for many people. It's definitely been tough for myself. We all almost had to, organize and do things on top of everything else that we had. But I think that's a small contribution that we can make given what our brothers and sisters are going through in Gaza.
Yeah, you touched on the shadow banning. I realize even with my Instagram and Facebook, my Facebook's dead at this point in time because I think the Meta's done something, so I'm pretty sure I'm shadow banned. But I think as well with the outreach and the content, Twitter seems to be the place where you can get information a lot quicker. It's a bit more thorough as well, and there's a lot more activism. I know I recently found out through some friends and also on Twitter about a way to help Palestinians. I don't know if you heard about the eSIM that you can kind of send out to people in Palestine. So because of the outage in electricity and water, and so they won't have reception as a result, people I think it's within the Twitter community that kind of came out and said that there is a way for Palestinians to have access to power, and the reception through the phones is through these eSIMs. So a lot of people actually bought eSIMs for in behalf of Palestinians. So they'll buy the eSIM, they'll send it off to a Palestinian activist on Twitter. There's a few. The names are skipping my mind, and they are also getting in touch with people on the ground in Palestine and then giving those eSIMs. And I think that's only possible through Twitter specifically, or X, because on Facebook and other platforms it seems to be getting rid of any or trying to eradicate as much Palestinian activism as possible.
I think they just kind of say that anyone that says Palestine or Gaza or certain words is just being pushed back and shadow banned and things like this.
Yeah, it's that's why I guess we're trying to, and yourself, that's why you're on Twitter, to try to see what we can do and try to be amongst the conversation, because I think that's where it is at the moment.
Yep, absolutely.
So I wanted to also ask you, because speaking of social media, on YouTube, a lot of people have been, a lot of interview clips have been going viral online specifically. So the more famous one would be the Piers Morgan show. And there's a constant recurring theme where whoever comes on the show keeps getting asked the same question, specifically when it's a pro-Palestinian activist, about the whole nature of condemning the attacks. So I've actually released an episode with Yasir and asked him this question, and he's answered in a particular way. So I'm curious to know, like, especially with yourself, who's involved in the community, how would you go about addressing the question of how would you address the question of do you condemn the attacks of Hamas on October 7th? Because would you say it is an issue condemning Hamas, and if so, how would you go about addressing it?
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Look, definitely, I think the issue is, the first thing to recognize is that it's a loaded question. And whether you're on media or whether you're speaking to someone in person or whether you're anywhere, responding directly to loaded questions is always a bit of a trap, right? This question is a trap. The reason it's a trap is because it comes with so much baggage, which is what it means to say it's loaded. You have to accept a number of unexplicated, unspoken premises before you can even answer the question, whether you go with a yes or a no, or a maybe, or anything else, right? So, do you condemn Hamas? Assumption number one, whatever's being said in the media and in the mainstream about what Hamas did on October 7th is as it is, right? You have to take that for a given. Hamas is a declared terrorist organization. You have to take that as a given. And so on and so forth. And so you're kind of boxed and cornered, and now you got to do this. So I think if you have time to speak in an everyday context, you can unpack and discuss. In a media context, it's a lot harder. And what you would see with the interviewers is they'll push back. So even if a lot of the what I'm seeing that's really good now is Muslim representatives don't fall for the trap. They're not going with a yes or a no, right? Rather, they're trying to unpack. But then what you find is that the interviewer will go, hang on a minute, yes or no? Do you condemn them, bud? Yes or no, right? They'll try and keep them in the corner. So I think you have to avoid being trapped in that corner. How you do it depends. So this, I thought in this situation, if I were to do a media interview, how would I do it? And sometimes I feel like I would go straight with a no and then explain myself. But then I feel like if you do that, you might be sending the wrong message at the same time. And that's the point, right? So if I were to say no, and I think this is true of most Muslims, we're not saying it's okay to, behead babies and torture people and rape people and whatnot. But that's precisely what is being attached almost inextricably to what happened on October 7th. So October 7th in the mainstream stands for sort of this modern equivalent of a medieval pillaging raid where people just come in to kill and rape and torture and whatnot. And so the hard work is to separate that and say, well, leaving aside the fact of, what actually happened. And once you get into that, that's a rabbit hole in itself. But I think we should be able to show that, events like this, and it's not unique, various events in history, even if they comprise of certain crimes, don't have to be reduced to that. I'll just give you one example because my answer is going to be long here. And I made this point on Twitter. The French Revolution. The French Revolution is celebrated in the West. It's a founding moment. It's a moment of progress and the move to liberation and liberty and democracy and, all these other wonderful values. The French Revolution comprises large amounts of terror. Like literally, there's a part of the French Revolution called the Reign of Terror with a capital T, where people are going around killing people. There's executions without trial in the hundreds, not like a few here and there. In the hundreds, people are being put to the guillotine without trial, right? And so on and so forth. The founding of Australia, Australia celebrates that. The founding of the US, both of these comprise ethnic cleansing, and genocide at a mass scale. Like it's hard to describe the massacres and the intent of these people. But what happens in those instances, however, and this is the problem. In those instances, it's okay for Westerners to celebrate that because the assumption straight away is, of course, they're not celebrating the massacres and the terror and the rest of. They're not celebrating that, right? They're celebrating the fact that the French Revolution brought in these values, and it was a pushback against the ancien regime, the church, which had become corrupt, and the kingdom, and so on and so forth. Likewise, the founding of America obviously was a great moment, a step forward, and the founding of Australia. So I feel like, I think if we have the time and ability, it's not hard to explain that moments like this can be, even October 7th should be seen not only for the details of what went on, but a breaking of a siege, a breaking of a brutal siege, a pushback by people that are resisting a brutal occupation, and so on and so forth. However, what happens is you'll see in the media, and you'll see, Zionist propagandists, anyone that says anything remotely positive it's attached straight away to, oh, you're supporting rape and torture and beheadings and so on. You're a monster. And I think that type of false inference has to be rejected outright.
Yeah, I think because what you pretty much elaborated on is that there's that assumption that Hamas is terroristic, barbaric, this and that, almost pretty much an ISIS, right? Just a different name. And because of that, it becomes like a moralizing question. Like it's just trying to vet you, kind of, it's almost like a sieve. Like, let's see if you pass this test. Test number one is
yeah. It's a test of your humanity. It's a test of your humanity, because specifically when in the mind of the questioner, and as per the mainstream narrative, if October 7th is about beheading babies, for example, and you're asking me, do I condemn it? You're basically asking me, am I not a monster? Can you please prove to me that you're not a monster who secretly supports the beheading of babies? Right? And that's absolutely ridiculous. This is why the question shouldn't be answered directly, and it should be pushed back and say, that we reject the premises of these questions.
It's funny because I was actually talking to my wife, and we did like a thought experiment. Imagine for example, there's a white supremacist that does a massacre to a school or whatever, and would you as a Muslim go up to a white person and be like, do you condemn the white supremacist attacks that happened in that white school or something, or that Christian school? Like, it'd just be like an absurd thing to do as a Muslim. I'm just thinking of a thought process. Like, I'll never do that to someone. Like, why is it? Then I realize it's because we don't operate from that framework. Like, we don't operate trying to. We just assume everyone's has that humanity in them anyway, so we just kind of go about our day. But then for us, when we're under the spotlight as Muslims, as Arabs, as brown people, we're under the microscope in that regard. So it's crazy how it's like a different world, different framing, different framework.
Absolutely. And I think one point I'd add here to that very good observation, I think part of the thing is part of the moralizing. You said how you observed how it's a moralizing approach. I think part of it is to distract from where the discussion should actually be. So, when anything like this happens, or other conflicts, and obviously it's been the same in the past, the war on terror, the last 20 years was the same. Something happened somewhere, Muslims are brought on to condemn. No one wants to understand the situation. What should be happening is contextualization, understanding, analysis. Why is this happening? Who is happening? But that would only happen if there's an assumption that we're all human. We're all human. We're all worried about violence, excessive or gratuitous violence, unjustified violence. We're all worried. None of us support terror. None of us support crimes. So that should be taken as a given, and then we should talk about analysis and contextualization and what the solutions to this problem may be. And that's what we are prepared to do, but we're not allowed to do that. All you have to keep doing is proving your humanity, because, and this is the point I want to make, as soon as you move into the contextualization and the analysis, it's that very mainstream Western states and governments, media, in this case, the Zionist entity, that will be shown to be the primary criminal and problem in these issues.
In regards to Hamas, and it's made out to be the bogeyman. Before I ask you, in regards to why is Hamas being used as a bogeyman, especially by Western media and Israel, I also wanted to ask the question, who is Hamas? Because the context sometimes isn't given that they were democratically elected by people. Palestine, for example, they're pretty much resisting the occupation of the Israeli government. So they are a resisting force in that regard. And there isn't that many resistance movements in that regard on the ground. So could you maybe shed light on Hamas, what do they do in that regard, who they are, And yeah,
Yeah, just yeah, briefly. So obviously, there's a longer historical context here that we might get to a bit later on about the history of Palestine, the modern history. But of course, I mean, following the establishment of Israel and the expulsion of 700,000 to 1 million people, the making of refugees, a number of wars that followed, the Palestinians have since then been in very, very dire circumstances. Their homes have been stolen. They've been forced into very, very dilapidated and difficult circumstances. Refugee camps in Palestine, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and so on and so forth. The natural reaction to that of any human and any group of humans is to resist, and the Palestinians have done that. They've resisted intellectually. They've resisted politically, activism-wise, whatever they could do. But also part of what humans do is to resist materially, armed struggle. And armed struggle is accepted to be a part of the way that people who are oppressed will resist. It's part of international law. It's part of the understanding of any moral framework. So Hamas represents one manifestation of the armed struggle component of Palestinian resistance. It's established in 1987. Following, I would add, and this is interesting because I don't want to get into the longer history. You might do that a bit later, but Hamas is established after peace process efforts in which Palestinians were willing to make significant compromises because their situation became so dire. Were not exhausted, but made entirely difficult, very, very difficult, if not prohibitive. Israel was not interested in any sort of two-state solutions. The US was not interested, and the Palestinians were just left to linger while settlements were increasing, the brutalities were increasing. And so in the end, Hamas is really, in a nutshell, Hamas is the last resort that the Palestinian resistance has had to take, one form of the last resort after, really being brutalized for such a long period of time. And it's gone through various phases. The part where they were elected in 2005, 2006. Again, this is used to kind of say, again, in the mainstream narrative, Hamas is just the boogeyman. There's no context, there's no details. It's just monster, right? And that's done deliberately. But if we keep the context and the history in mind and the political, economic circumstances in mind, it's one part of the Palestinian resistance. That doesn't mean necessarily that every single action it takes will be justified. Doesn't mean that. That's not true of every single, human effort. But nevertheless, to reduce it to some sort of monster, I think is absolutely incorrect, and it's done with a political agenda in mind. When Israel finally left the Gaza Strip to its own devices, and there was free and fair elections, Hamas was elected. And this is, again, how that's understood in the mainstream is to say, oh my God, or at least by Zionist propagandists, is to say, Hamas is a monster, the Palestinians have elected them. The Palestinians are also monsters. Otherwise, why would they elect a monster, right? Whereas the reality is the opposite. The people elected them because they saw that these people were willing to sacrifice for the cause. And they saw that the opposite, which is Fatah, the PLO at a certain point, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, later became Fatah, were seen more to be collaborating and making compromises with Israel. That's why they were elected. It's not like Palestinians had 10 different options and things were really, really great, but they went with a violent form of resistance. The resistance went in that direction because there was no other options on the table, and people elected them because they saw them to be more sincere, more willing to sacrifice for the cause. That, I would say, is Hamas in a nutshell. But of course, none of that can be explored or explained in mainstream media.
So why do you think they're made out to be the bogeyman in the Western media and by Israel? Especially, I watched a bit of Ben Shapiro and his interview. Was it in what was it called? Oxford Union?
Yeah, the Oxford Union address.
Yeah, and it's kind of made out to be Hamas terrorist this and that. We got to do what we can to get them out because they're just killers and terrorists, and all that sort of narratives and notion is portrayed pretty commonly. So why do you think that's the case, that the Western media and such influential figures are going?
Well, I think it's fairly simple. Any oppressive regime needs justification to persist in its aggressions. And the easiest way to justify them is to have a boogeyman. Right? Same thing what America did in Vietnam, what it did in Iraq. Right? So how do you orchestrate a war in Iraq where there's no real grounds for it? You make a boogeyman. There's weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein, uses chemical weapons, and he does this and he does that, and there's babies in incubators or some story that they made up about that, and now you can justify war. So the reason Hamas has made a boogeyman is in order for Israel to continue doing what it was doing before Hamas existed. And I made this point on Twitter, where what's happening right now is Hamas is being blamed for everything, even Israel's actions. So when it's pointed out that Israel is now currently carrying out a genocide in Gaza, the Zionist propagandists like Shapiro and others are saying, blame Hamas, it's Hamas's fault, right? Which is, like the extent of blaming others for your own actions. But I made the point that the notion that you can blame everything on Hamas now makes no sense, because before Hamas existed, before 1987, the dynamics on the ground were exactly the same. Essentially, not exactly, essentially the same, right? The Palestinians were living in extremely difficult situations, refugees, occupation, expanding settlements, Israeli aggressions through wars and bombings of refugee camps, and so on and so forth. So, we're going to go back in time and blame Hamas for that as well. So it's, in my mind, this is really not that complicated. Hamas is being used for Israel to continue its aggressions. The broader point I would also make here, just to finish this point off, I think it's important to understand sort of the broader strategy that Israel has used since its inception, which has been to continue expanding itself, taking more land, expelling more people, expanding its borders, whilst the whole time claiming victimhood. Whilst claiming the whole time that we're being attacked, all these Arabs want to kill us, they want to drive us into the sea, that whole narrative. And I think that's the clearest example of just transparent propaganda, right? You're the one that is in the stronger position. You're the one that's expanding, taking more land, stealing more resources, so on and so forth. And you keep claiming victimhood. So in that scenario, it becomes clear why you're claiming victimhood, because it allows you to keep doing what you're doing.
And what's interesting, I always found that from a public sentiment perspective, that people are seeing that Israel, an established state, and doing atrocities in that regard, and bombing Gaza, etc. And then they're seeing Palestinians in this way. It's like they're oppressed people, but then it's like Israel doesn't have to dig too deep to lie too hard. Like sometimes you have to have a sophisticated lie to come up with this rational argument in order to justify something, right? But in this regard, it doesn't seem like they have to try too hard in order to lie, and then they're getting support from US with the snap of the fingers, that kind of thing. So what's your thoughts about that notion of their lies, or their you mentioned victimhood? Doesn't seem like they have to reach too far to play that card, and it sort of favors them as well, even though everyone sort of sees it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's because so here there's two levels, right? There's the narrative level, there's the discourse, where Israel, the propaganda pumps out certain concepts, certain ideas to justify what it wants to do. Then there's the political level, right? And of course, narrative and discourse in many respects is the handmaiden of politics and power. So the reason Israel doesn't have to try too hard and it can just say anything is because, politically speaking, it's in a very strong position because it's got the backing of America and Europe. So the current superpowers of the day and the superpowers of the last 50, 75 years, longer, but obviously Israel has been around for 75 years. In this entire period, the superpowers have been European powers first and then America. They stand firmly behind Israel. When that happens, you don't need to try too hard. You can say whatever you want. No one's going to hold you to account, because the people who could hold you to account, because to hold someone to account, you need to be either at their level of strength or stronger. Right? Otherwise, all I can do is speak. I can say my mind, but I can't hold you to account. And obviously, it's still important to speak. But in the given context, it's only the US or European powers that can hold Israel to account. There's obviously the Muslim rulers and the regimes are part of the equation. We can maybe come back to that later as well. But by and large, a lot of those are proxy extensions of European or American power in the main. So, but it doesn't have to do that, right? Because the US has given it a carte blanche. Israel, from the beginning, was established as a colonial outpost in the Middle East. It serves European and American power. In fact, I'll go a step further to say that for all its problems and for all its transgressions and for all its evil, really, Israel is not the fundamental problem. Israel is a tool that was originally used by Britain and France because they were the powers at the time. And then when America took over power after World War II, it continued this for their interests. And anyone who even takes a cursory glance at the history, starting from the late 19th century onwards, can see clearly that this is a lot more about Europe, firstly, and then the US than it is about Israel. Of course, Israel has its own agendas and strategies, and definitely should be held to account for that. But the fundamental problem in my mind is good old, colonialism, come neo-colonialism after World War II. So yeah, short answer, they don't have to try very hard to, make lies that even make sense because no one's going to ask them otherwise. In fact, let me throw in an example here. What we're seeing in the current scenario is Israel can bomb anything, schools, hospitals, bakeries, anyone. And all they have to do is say Hamas was somewhere there. There was tunnels under the hospital. They were, buying bread in that morning from the bakery, or they were, doing something at the school. Just say that. That's it. For the last 1 month, all whether it be the Ahli hospital or the 15 odd other hospitals that have been bombed, the schools, the bakeries, no one's seen any evidence that Hamas was there. And there is no process of independent verification in this respect. So, yeah, it's largely an equation of power. And in many ways, the whole conflict, the whole issue is a case of powerful people doing what they like and exceeding all bounds of humanity and morality.
Touching on your point about narratives, power, and like, for example, you just talked about how all Israel have to say is Hamas was there and then they can justify anything, right? There was this, it's always perpetuated in the media, and with my sort of research in regards to the whole notion of Hamas beheading babies, right? It was just repeated in the media, it was just said everywhere, and it's almost like no one really checked it, or even to the point where people might know it's not even a true thing, but they're still saying it anyway. It's almost like it's synonymous with Hamas beheading babies, almost like ISIS beheading innocent people. It's a kind of that correlation, right? So I also wanted to ask, was there any validity to the accusation of Hamas beheading babies? And also, on top of that, there was a whole firing of the missile at Al-Ahli hospital, and Hamas came out and said that it was fired from Israel. Israel said that it was a misfiring from Hamas that landed in the hospital. So, I guess it adds on to the conversation talking about narratives. And from what I've seen is that, firstly, it's Israel that did the firing at the Ahli hospital. And the fact that they just can come out and be like, oh, it was Hamas instead, and people kind of went with it. It sort of goes to the point about justifying it, but also with the whole notion of the narratives and the beheading babies. And, it's not really fact-checked, but it's just, the media just kind of goes with the flow. So what are your thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, so the media or the Western leaders and politicians, they don't have like an objective, impartial motivation to move towards justice or do what's correct. They have their own political agendas. Media is more worried about ratings, and they've got certain connections and certain people. The Murdoch media, for example, with clear agendas. But these are good examples, you know, that the beheading babies, like, it's just that's unbelievable case of you're making such an extraordinary accusation with pretty much no evidence. And to this day, no evidence has been presented in the court of world opinion, right? Rather, what happened is a claim was made, and in fact, I think the claim was traced to like one person somewhere in Israel, and some other Israeli officials denied the existence of evidence to that as well along the way. But no, there was no evidence was presented. It went all over the media. Then some media outlets retracted, saying there's no evidence. Others just continued running with it. And then at some point we're told, Joe Biden's seen the photos. It's like, what? So your mate, you showed the photos to your mate, but you can't show them to anyone else. So that was a complete farce. With the Ahli hospital. So I think one thing we have to keep in mind here is, with a lot of these things, it's very difficult in the end for people outside to judge one way or the other, because you've got claims here, claims there. It's not like there's independent verification happening on the ground. It's a warlike situation. But I think what people can do is place the particular incident in a broader context, and this is what contextualization is always important. And this is why those on the other side, those on the oppressors in this situation, don't want you to contextualize. So, for example, Hamas beheaded 40 babies. When was the last time in Hamas's 87 to 2023? What's that? 20, 30 years, 35 years or something. When was the last time Hamas beheaded any babies? Never. Right. So what? So they now decided that there's a new mode of operation all of a sudden. Similarly, put the hospital bombing in its context. Has Israel bombed other hospitals in Gaza in the current operation? Yes, more than one. Multiple hospitals have been bombed. Has Israel and Zionist propagandists like Shapiro and others been justifying to the hilt, like 100% justifying the bombing of hospitals? Yes. They've all been saying, anytime a hospital has been bombed or a school, they've been saying, well, Hamas uses human shields. Well, Hamas is under the hospital in its tunnels. What do you want us to do? In other words, they've been justifying it. So Israel's done it elsewhere. It justifies it. Again, when was the last time a Hamas misfired rocket blew up, part of a hospital? Never. Literally never. Like, this is the thing. You know what I mean? So this is my point. Obviously, we can go on, but it's quite simple in my mind. Yes, we're not going to be able to tell 100% because we don't have all the information. This applies for everyone, but it doesn't take too much operationalization of brain cells to place these incidents in a greater context to see who's doing what.
It's interesting you brought up Hamas not beheading babies in the past, and is it something that they have a different mode of operation now? Like, I think what can be analyzed and something I guess food for thought is that we have that whole narrative of ISIS beheading people, and they were actually doing that. I wonder if it's because of the Western image of ISIS. It's easy to just associate beheadings with terrorism, and therefore you associate beheadings to Hamas. Therefore, you can kind of make that association without saying that it's like, oh, there's a terrorist organization, because that's what they do. So I wonder if like that narrative was espoused to portray things in a certain way. But I think in regards to you mentioned about human shields. What's your thoughts about that as well? Because everyone keeps talking about it. It gets brought up a lot as well. And I mean, frankly, to my estimation, it doesn't seem like there's any basis for it either. Similarly, like
this is another one of those claims that's part of a certain narrative, a certain propaganda regime that is used to allow you to do whatever you want. You just say Hamas uses human shields. The evidence, again, from third parties. This part of the problem here is almost everything that comprises the Zionist narrative, the Israeli/Zionist narrative. The evidence for it, when you look into it, goes back to claims made by Israeli authorities, right? Either government authorities or the IDF, and that's like the height of a circular argument. That's the height of circularity. It's like, this is what's happening because we say so. Okay, if you have now, to be fair, we could say, well, okay, let's not listen to Israel. Let's not also go with what Hamas says, or with those part of the Palestinian resistance who are a conflict to the party, right? Because the general way of assessing or verifying claims in a dispute is not to go by the parties to the dispute. There has to be some sort of independent verification, testimony, other forms of evidence. And this is where the picture becomes very clear, because as soon as you go to independent sources like human rights organizations, Israeli and international, right? So Beit Shalom is an Israeli human rights organization. There are others in Israel, and there's various, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. As soon as you read their reports, any part of the last 50, 75 years, it becomes extremely clear who's doing what, right? This is why Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have referred to Israel as an apartheid state. They have referred to Israel as engaged in genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth. So the question was about human shields again. So if you go to the independent, if you ask for independent evidence, documentation, it doesn't exist of Hamas using human shields. Now, on that point, in fact, and Norman Finkelstein makes his point quite well, and I don't know if anyone has studied this issue and the voluminous documentation by human rights organizations as much as he has over the last 40 years. He makes his point very well that when you look on the issue of human shields, what you don't find any credible evidence that Hamas has used human shields. You actually find evidence that Israel has used Palestinians as human shields at certain points in time. So yeah, this is just one of the, and this is what you'll find in a lot of what we discuss when you study the conflict. So much of it is propaganda that it's hard to believe.
Subhanallah, exactly. And I know you touched on Hamas's history in terms of how they came about. But also wanted to ask you, would you be able to outline the broad history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, and I think the broader history is extremely important. Now, obviously, it's very long, but let me try and outline it very broadly, because otherwise 100 Gs is going to take us more time than we have. At a very broad level, I would divide the history into probably 3 phases. And I would begin this in the late 19th century. So the late 19th century, say 1880 to the establishment of Israel would be the first phase. And then you'd probably have a couple of phases there between 48 and 67 or 73, a couple of wars, and then 73 onwards. And at a very broad level, what we find in the first phase is the birth of a Zionist organization in Europe that is responding to the Jewish question. So in Europe, there was a Jewish question, just as today in the West there is a Muslim question, although now it's not as explicit, right? Racism in the West is no longer as explicit. Okay, that doesn't mean it's there. There's still strong underpinnings of racism. But in the late 18th century, it was explicit. So explicitly intellectuals and people were discussing the Jewish question. What do we do with these Jews? They do this, they do that. So anti-Semitism was, on steroids in Europe. So what happens in the 1880s is you get the start of the Zionist movement where basically Jewish intellectuals are saying that integration is no longer a possibility. There's pogroms in Russia. In Germany and Austria, anti-Semitism is on the rise. And, Jewish leaders are saying, well, we don't have a place in Europe anymore. All right, so what do? The solution is to find a homeland elsewhere. And although a couple of suggestions are thrown out, Theodor Herzl, people probably heard the name, he's one of the founders and leaders of the Zionist movement. He actually publishes a book in, I think it's 1897, or 1899, something this period. He publishes a book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And that's in it, it's quite explicit that the solution to the Jewish question, the proper solution in his mind, is for the establishment of a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, which is also a state. It's independent. How is that a solution? Well, because it allows Jews to have a nation like everyone else has a nation, and they can do their own thing, because anytime they live as a minority with someone else, they get persecuted. That's the story that he tells. Anyway, so I would summarize that part of the history as saying Europe's racism, Europe's very, very strong racism and anti-Semitism is flung onto a people who had nothing to do with it, right? Because in the end, the Zionists decide that Palestine is the right place. So this is what I was going to mention. In the book, Herzl also floats the idea of Argentina as a place where there could be a Jewish homeland. But they agree on Palestine, and we know the claims that make to Palestine. Jews have always been there. There was a kingdom of Judea and Israel, 3,000 years ago. There's been a continuous Jewish presence there. And for some, they would throw in religious claims that it's a promised land. God promised them that land, and so on. So that's why Palestine is chosen. But anyway, so that's the movement. Now, the rest of that first part, in a nutshell, is that Jews start immigrating to Palestine from Europe, by and large from Europe, to the extent that, just to give a sense of numbers, in the 1880s, Palestine is under Ottoman control, right? Of course, until the British Mandate. In the 1880s, the Jewish presence in Palestine is about 2 to 3%, proportion of the population, Jews compared to Muslims and Christians. Muslims are about 85%. I think Christians are about 9%, something like this. There's also, already in the 1880s, there's about 10,000 Jews who've migrated. So total maybe 5%. So it's 3% indigenous, 2% have come out from outside. There's about 25,000 Jews in Palestine. Now, I'm not going to go through all the history, but by the time, before the establishment, by about 1946, Jews comprise some 30% of the population. 3% to 30%. This is before anything's been established, right? And so there's a clear strategy for Jews to migrate in large numbers and change the demographics and then claim statehood. And everyone knew that because this is what the Zionist movement was about. And so after that, obviously, in the second phase, there's been the state's been established. Obviously, the British mandate's important, I should mention. The Ottomans, Herzl actually approaches the Ottomans to buy the land. And then he approaches the Ottomans. He actually beats Sultan Abdul Hamid II, first offering him 20 million pounds. Yeah, 20 million pounds, which at the time is a huge amount. We're talking billions of dollars in terms of today's money. He offers him 20 million pounds to buy land in Palestine, and Sultan Abdul Hamid says, no, this is the land our people have spilt blood to have and to grow. We're not going to sell that at any point. He comes back and he also offers to, now the Ottoman state is in debt, is in serious debt to European finances and European powers. And the Sultan and the Ottomans don't want to happen what's already happened in Egypt, which is that Egypt's defaulted on its debts and it's been occupied, right? And so Herzl then also says, we'll take your debt, we'll consolidate your debt, all sorts of things, but the Ottomans say no. The Ottomans make the wrong decision in World War I, I'm fast forwarding here, to make the wrong decision in World War I to side with the Allies, which doesn't mean they should have sided with the Axis, not the Allies, which is not to say they should have allied with the Allies. They should have stayed out of the war. It wasn't our war, it was Europe's war. But they made the wrong decision. They come out on the wrong side because of that war, and because of traitors amongst the Muslims, led by Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, Sharif Hussein of the Hashemite kingdom, and Lawrence of Arabia. Everyone knows Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. the British take large parts of this area, including Palestine. So it comes under British mandate. Now the British want to facilitate the Zionist project. This is why the Balfour Declaration. So these are things people probably recognize. The Balfour Declaration, 1917. Britain promises the Zionists that they will have this land. Anyway, there's a few other things. They actually they promise the Zionists that they'll give the land to them. They promise Sharif Hussein that it will be given to him. There'll be an Arab kingdom that he will lead. McMahon does this, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. And they also, Sykes-Picot, people would have heard of that, 1918, I think. The actual intention is Sykes-Picot, which is to divide up the land amongst the British and the French. So imagine the Brits, this is how they operate. They promise the land to 3 different people, right? Themselves, but also to the Zionists and also to the Arabs. Anyway, so they take the land, they control it, but they facilitate Zionist Jewish immigration. And then eventually, because of that, it's facilitated. So now the land's lost, right? The land's not in our control. It's in European control. And in the end, in 1948, it's established. Moving quickly to the second stage and the third stage, really, we can summarize that. There's not too much there. In fact, maybe we can come back a bit later on, because the Zionist claim is that Israel's always wanted peace and the Arabs have always rejected peace, which is completely untrue. But basically, I think, let me just make one more point, because this has gone a little bit long. The British mandate ends in, I think, 46 or 47. The UN, previous to that, there's a Peel Commission plan as well, which offers, I think, 30% of the land to the Zionists and 70 to the Palestinians or the Arabs, which is rejected by both sides in origin. But anyway, in 1947, the partition plan is meant to give, I think, 44% of the land to the Palestinians and 56% to the Jews, who comprise about 30% of the demographic. Let that sink in. The people who are 30% are being offered 56% of the land, right? So that was the impartiality of the UN, and before it, the League of Nations. So anyway, that's the partition plan. But what actually happens, and this is the thing, right? Again, I'm giving some numbers here to give a broad sense. The original Peel Commission, which is a British commission, suggested 70% of the land for the Palestinians. By 1947, the UN is saying, no, you only get 44%. Massive decrease. When time comes, when the British pull out and Israel, of its own accord, self-proclaims its independence and establishes itself, and war breaks out, and it's successful in that war, it actually takes, 78%. 22 is left with the Palestinians, 22% of the land, right? And then in 67, when Israel preemptive, and this is the thing, both in 48 and in 67, what you'll hear from Zionist propagandists is that the Arabs started war, they wanted to kill us off and this and that. In both cases, Israel actually started the war through preemptive strikes. And that word should be, that word should resonate with people as well, because George Bush did the same thing in Iraq. How did he justify the war in Iraq? Preemptive strikes against weapons of mass destruction. Anyway, so 67, Israel's bombed Egypt. War started out, the 6-Day War. People probably heard of that. And now Israel's taken even more land. Right? In the end, Palestinians were only left with Gaza and the West Bank, and the West Bank was also occupied, and there were settlements and whatnot. So Gaza and the West Bank comprised like 10%, 12%. That's literally what they got in the end. And then from the 70s onwards, it's been a case of various peace process plans and whatnot. Maybe we can talk about that when we get to, the claim that the Arabs never wanted peace. But basically, that's what it's been. In a nutshell, I would summarize 1970 to today by saying that Israel's never wanted peace. The proof of that is the expanding settlements. So this is one of the ways to see that Israel's never been bona fide or good faith about wanting even a two-state solution. It's rather always been about expansion and the establishment of a greater Israel and so on and so forth, which is that, you can see, as I've already explained, the Palestinians were meant to be given 70, then 44, they only got 22, then they only got 10. And even in that 10, Israel keeps expanding settlements into the West Bank. Someone who does that, but then also makes the claim that we want peace is lying in your face. Like, they're just laughing at you and lying to your face, right? So anyway, the last 50 odd years have been a case of Israel continually expanding, bombing Gaza, bombing South Lebanon, wherever it wants, refugee camps in South Lebanon, initiating wars and then blaming the other side, but not being interested in peace. There's been various peace plans put in place, but Israel and the US have not been interested. From the mid-70s onward, the PLO has been willing to compromise for a two-state solution. A two-state solution, one that goes back to the 22%, which is what's 22%? It's very, very small. But Israel has not been interested in any of that because, particularly with the right-wing government of the likes of Netanyahu in place, they're not interested in giving Palestinians anything. They're interested in taking Gaza. They're interested in taking the West Bank. But obviously, you can't do that just outright because that goes too far for the US and for European powers, particularly for the US. And so they're going to do it through these types of means. And this is part of the long game. Let me end on this point. What's happening in Gaza is part of this longer history. You can see what they're doing now. They want to divide Gaza into north and south. And Netanyahu has already said, we're going to take northern Gaza and it's going to be like a security zone. It's going to be a security zone. They're going to take it. So now the 10% is going to go down to 7, 8. The settlements are still expanding in the West Bank, so it's going down to less. And in the end, what they want is for all the Palestinians, or by and large, to go to Egypt, to go to Jordan, to go elsewhere, so that they can have the entirety of the land.
What do you think of the counterpoint? People might be like, there were the Oslo Accords, for example, or the conversation about the two-state solution. Therefore, Israel was always in the discussion when it comes to peace talks or peace negotiations.
Yeah. So from the mid 1970s. Okay. So here's the thing. The Zionist argument is peace was offered in 1937, in 1947, in 1967, and in Oslo, and so that's their argument. The problem is when you actually look at the details of each of these instances, you see that that's a half truth. These are half truths. Sometimes they're outright lies. And I'm just going to use 2 examples because otherwise it takes a long time. We're told prior to establishment, we're told that, and this is what Ben Shapiro at the Oxford, you mentioned the Oxford Union debate or address that he did. This is what he does. He'll roll off the names, right? So the Peel Commission offered you this, the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 offered this, blah, 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 but the Arabs weren't interested. Let's just look at 2 of those. The Peel Commission, it's in the British Commission. There was unrest in Palestine in the 1932, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the Peel Commission was an investigation about that. And in the end, in 37, it came up with this idea that the Zionists can be given 30% and the Palestinians should get 70%. Now, the Zionists say, well, that was rejected. Okay? And then it looks like, well, you were being given a big portion. Why would you reject that? You're not interested in peace. But the problem is the historical context. Here's a people, the Palestinians, the people living in that land, they've been there continuously for a long period of time, right? They're not making a claim like the Jews, which is, we were here 3,000 years ago and 2% of us have been around the whole time. These people have been here as a majority for decades and centuries in a row. Now, the Jews are coming in large numbers and claiming that they want an independent state. That's the context that's being missed here. If it's like, use the example of Australia, right? It's like, let's say a particular ethnicity or a particular religious group or whoever starts migrating to Western Australia and slowly builds up its migration. And when they're about 30%, they say, you know what? We want Western Australia as our separate state. You guys have the rest of Australia. We just want 30%. Okay, maybe Australia's a bit among, but most of it's desert, right? So let's take the Western Australian coast and the major cities. We want 30%. And then if Australia rejects that, they're being told you don't want peace. You see the thing? It's like you don't have a right. Hello, you don't have a right to divide a place up and take control of any percent. What gives you that right? Do you know what I mean? And this is where the arguments are sort of rolled out. Oh, well, we've been here since 3,000 years, and with God's chosen people, and God promised us that land. Okay, He promised you that land according to your interpretations of your scripture. How does that have anything to do for me or anyone else, right? And of course, secular people don't use that argument. Religious people use that argument. Secular people like Shapiro won't use it. They would just say things like, "Oh, well, Jews were always there. So were others." As I said, according to Jewish historians and Jewish and Zionist studies, from like the 16th century, 15th century to the late 19th century, Jews comprised about 1.5 to 3% of the population. So if being 3% over time gives you a right to the land, what about the 97%? Or what about, forget the Muslims, right? For argument's sake, what about the Christians that have always comprised a larger number than you? Do they have a right to establish a Christian state in Palestine? Zionists will say no. Do you know what I mean? So this is the point. It's like, I come to your home, I increase my numbers, and then I say, I'm taking 30%. And if you say, hang on a minute, it's my house, you say, oh, you don't want peace. That's the reality of pre-establishment offers. The other example that I would use, just as I said, to give one from both sides, is the same thing. As I said, from the mid-70s onwards, what happened, just to explain that point, what happened after establishment, right? Again, put things in context. First, you've come to someone else's house and made a claim to their bedroom and their lounge, okay? And you've kicked a large part of the family into the backyard, into the shed. And then you've said, we want 30%. The house owners have said, no. Why would we give you 30%? But they don't have control. There's a British mandate. The UN comes in, and the UN actually says, you know what? We're not going to just give them the bedroom and the lounge. We're going to throw in another 2 bedrooms, right? And the kitchen. They get 56%. And that's the plan that's going to be enacted because these people have power against your will. But then war breaks out because Israel starts it, preemptive, and actually takes all the bedrooms, the kitchen, the lounge, the bathroom, and gives you like one of the small bedrooms and parts of the backyard. Okay? Now, what's going to happen in this situation? At that point, obviously, the person kicked out into the shed is going to say, I don't accept this. They're not going to say, you know what? Okay, we accept your peace offers of taking the vast majority of my land. Who would do that? So what happens from 48 all the way to the mid-70s is the Palestinians are saying, this is utterly unfair. This is utterly wrong. We're not going to accept these offers because all the offers are saying Israel gets the larger portion. And the starting point of the Palestinian resistance is to take a principled stance and say, you don't have a right to any of it. This is our land. We have a right to all of it. Okay? Now, but of course, the Palestinians don't have power. The Arab regimes, which are by this point extensions of neo-colonial power, didn't want to do anything. And so the Palestinians were left with 22 and then, as I said, 10% only. From the mid-70s, by the mid-70s, the PLO at least, which was representing, there was no Hamas, who was representing the Palestinians, realized that they're not going to get anything. They don't have any power. So from a pragmatic perspective, at least from saying, okay, well, what do we have in our hands? They were willing to go with two-state solutions. They were willing to go with the 1967 borders, which is what the UN plans and the international community's suggestions were, in exchange for recognizing Israel. That same thing, that from the mid-70s onwards, this happened in, Yasser Arafat, who was heading the PLO, gives a speech in November of 1973 or 1974 at the UN General Assembly. This is famously known for the gun or the olive branch, where he puts out an olive branch and says, okay, effectively, we will recognize Israel, because up to this point they haven't recognized Israel for the reasons I've explained, right? It's our house. You can't just take all of it and say, please recognize us. But in 73, he says, we're willing to recognize, right? And we'll accept the 67 borders. And now there's going to be just negotiations over some details. And there's a UN resolution that's drafted along these lines in 76 that Israel rejects and the US rejects. Not only rejects, what it starts in December 75 is bombing Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon in order to destroy the whole process. And anyway, that's what continues. It's the same story with, people talk about Oslo. People talk about, Bill Clinton and the Camp David Accord. Yasser Arafat was there. He shook hands with Yitzhak Rabin and Bill Clinton to do a deal. What was he doing there? What was the handshake about? Not accepting peace. So, the PLO at least has said from the 70s onwards to this day, the Palestinian Authority is willing to accept what I would call is a humiliating compromise. I'm not blaming them for that. I'm just saying that in the larger scheme of things, it's as I explained. Someone comes to your house, kicks you into the shed on the outside, negotiates with you and says, all right, I'll give you the shed. And they take your double-story house with everything inside it, right? But they've been willing because what other options do they have? But because other parts, and this ties back to our original discussion, I'll end on this point, because Palestinian society as a whole saw that Israel was not good faith, not interested, continuing its brutalities, continuing its settlements, a portion of it said, there is no point in these negotiations, we're going to fight. Right? And that type of armed resistance is legitimate, even in international law. So, anyway, that's all about the Zionist lie that the Arabs have never been interested in peace.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that, like the reality that you depicted. Unfortunately, we have the other narrative going back to a further discussion about narratives in a holistic sense. What we have to endure as a community is that they're trying to depict like the Arab or the Palestinian as the ones that aren't willing to, do peace or have peaceful negotiations, right? And I think if I recall, was it Yasser Arafat that compared to the peace talks to, because people may have questioned him, like, why is this the case that it's happening? But he made the sort of equivalence to Hudaybiyah. Do you recall anything to that effect? I recall, listening to something like that.
That's a fairly common reference. I don't know specifically about Arafat, but I would take for granted that at some point he made that reference because Hudaybiyah is a compromise.
Yeah.
And he was willing to compromise.
Yeah, I guess in that context, that's the compromise that was had to be done in terms of because they couldn't find any other way in that regard, in terms of livelihood and all that. I also wanted to ask because we talked about, for example, World War One, the countries are involved, the British, etc. Because you've done your thesis on secularism, right? So these countries are built with secularist ideals and principles. And so, and these states have, secularist states have allied with, Israel and the Zionists. So it's just a question to you. Would you say that there's links with secularism as an idea, as a creed, if you may call it, or the excesses of secularism with the actions of Israel and Zionism?
Yes, my doctoral thesis was on secularism, and definitely there are some resonances between the Zionist movement and what's happened after that, and of course Europe and America were behind fully supporting Israel, and various aspects of secularism. Maybe I can mention a couple. One thing to keep in mind is Zionism as a movement that starts in the late 19th century is a secular movement. It's a secular nationalist movement, right? That one of the first things it does, and this is part of the zeitgeist of the time, right? Nationalism and people thinking of themselves as nations. One of the first things that Herzl and what's the other guy's name? Nathan Birnbaum, I think his name is, the guy that came up with the word Zionism in 1890. The word Zionism is coined in 1890 by Nathan Birnbaum, I think that's his name, Birnbaum. One of the first things these people do is to reimagine Jews as a nation, not just as a religious community, but as an ethnicity and as a nation, and therefore they should kind of naturally have a nation and have a state, because obviously now it's the age of nation states, and that's where we're moving towards. So this is what they do. But my point is that Zionism is a secular movement. It's not a religious movement in origin. But because there are divisions within Zionism, within Jews, within Israeli society, like all communities, there are different opinions and different sides and left and right. There are Orthodox Jews. In fact, of course, we all know that there are Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist. Many, right? In fact, I should mention in passing that this Nathan Birnbaum, who coined the term in 1890, about 25 to 30 years later, he turns anti-Zionist because he turns towards Orthodox traditional Judaism. And Orthodox traditional Judaism, or parts of it, are against Zionism for their own theological interpretations of Scripture and Judaism. We don't need to get into that. But my point is that the reason I went there was to say that there are religious elements, right? But otherwise, people like Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon and Ehud Barak and, all the way back to David Ben-Gurion and Theodore Herzl, these are not religious people. They're secular intellectuals, secular leaders. They've pushed a political agenda, and they've been effective at it. We give them that much. They've been effective, even though the means that they used were, prominently and eminently unjust. So that's one part. Zionism is a secular movement. The other part I would say is, Talal Assad makes this point as a critique of the popular imaginary that religion is prone to violence. Secularism is about tolerance. Secularism is about rationality and science, and moving towards rational politics as a way of negotiating our differences, right? So the idea is that religion, when you have differences, people start fighting and killing each other. Secularism is more enlightened than that. We have debates and discussions, we talk. Yet here we have Zionism as a secular ideology, backed by Britain and France as enlightened secular powers of the late 19th, moving into the 20th century. The US, of course, comes later into the picture as a secular liberal democracy. All of these people are inflicting immense amounts of violence to advance a political agenda, dispossessing hundreds of thousands of people, inflicting a occupation, taking land, and so on and so forth, stealing resources. This is all secular violence, right? And so a large part of my thesis, or not large, but a significant part of my thesis was looking at this argument, critiquing this argument on the back of people like Talal Assad and others, that somehow religions are more prone to violence, and in the modern world we've moved away from that because now we're enlightened. No, as Assad argues, all that's happened is that the parameters and the motivations and the concepts and discourses around violence have shifted. And now we've got secular violence, and in many ways, secular violence has been far, far more devastating than religious violence. And of course, the two world wars are classic examples, but the same kind of thing plays out in the gratuitous and devastating amounts of violence that Zionism inflicts in Palestine.
Yeah, we see it's that kind of narrative as well, predicated on racism, where there's in Islam there's so many divisions. Shias and Sunnis always fighting, and I don't know. That's why we have a situation in Lebanon. Like they'll make those sort of arguments in that regard as well. It could be Yemen and Saudi, and look at those countries fighting, and there's that kind of constant narrative depicted by, obviously, with the more non-Muslim camp or liberals or secularists in that regard. They like latching onto that to make that argument. But yeah, like if you see, I think even through human history, like the devastation of colonization or devastation of US, the British have done to, the rest of the world is just, grotesque. It's, devastating. And yeah, in human history, I would say so.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the point here is not to say that religions, religious ideologies or ways of life don't entail violence. It's not saying that. It's just saying that the asymmetry, to start on this asymmetry that somehow religious ways of life are more violent and secular ways of life are more rational and tolerant, and they're all about holding hands and having discussions in parliament, is nonsense. They both entail elements of violence. Of course, when we study the details of the 19th and 20th century, you see that secularism has outclassed any previous religion in terms of its violence that it's inflicted. But yeah, the reason, Saudi, Yemen, or Sunni, Shia, and whatever happens in the Muslim world, the reason that's ascribed to religion is the same reason that we have this idea of the European wars of religion. Before secularism, the idea is that we had European wars of religion, Protestants and Catholics killing each other because they couldn't work out theological disputes, right? That's a very weak narrative or argument that's been thoroughly critiqued. One of the best books on this is by William Kavanagh, titled "The Myth of Religious Violence," published by Oxford University Press, I think 2009 or 2012, off the top of my head. Very good book that literally looks at the so-called European wars of religion and explains to say that the linking of the violence to religion is on very weak grounds, right? And there's various reasons. I'm not going to go into them now. He explains. People can have a look at that in their own time.
So just to ask this question before I jump on to shifting the discussion in towards activism in terms of Palestine, would you say that, like, because it also links with the earlier point about how Zionism rose from, I guess, the actions or the Jewish people not finding a home that regarded that racism in Europe, right? And so as a result, like Christendom, so if we go back to you have the secular liberal ideals that propagate as a result of the church and state, and the dogmatic approach to it. It can be, I guess, it could be a narrative that I have fallen into. So I'll just, out of curiosity, to get your side of the story or your thoughts, because the narrative that's depicted, it's like the dogmatic approach of the state when it comes to knowledge acquisition. It comes to quote unquote scientific thought and free thinking wasn't facilitated, wasn't allowed. Therefore, there was a quote unquote liberals had a sort of reaction to that, and then there was that scientific revolution as a result, all that sort of stuff, and it's sort of justified as to why some secular academics might justify that as a reason why secularism is the way in terms of peace and coexistence in comparison to religious ways of thinking or political ways of understanding when it comes to religion ruling, or in that case I just mentioned Christendom. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to boil down the possibility of these sort of tussles throughout history seen as a result of dogmatic approach of Christendom, if that makes sense. Whereas you just mentioned that there's been books written on the fact that it's not necessarily as a result of religion, quote unquote. But I guess as Muslims, we might be quicker to kind of put it on Christendom, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, look, history is complicated. No doubt the Catholic Church did various things that it probably shouldn't have done. I think Catholics will accept that from the Pope down. Having said that, there is a lot of back projection. And history is written by the victors. History is written by people. Everyone has a bias. Everyone is embedded in terms of their perspectivity, and all the stories we tell and the histories we write come from certain perspectives. So you have to be wary of that. When I say back projection, so secular authors and writers are writing the history, and they're putting a lot onto religion. It's one thing to say that a particular institution was corrupt. It's another thing to say that there's something inherent about religion as a category. So, because it's not even, they don't say there's something inherent to Christianity or Catholicism. It's religion, right? And in many ways, that's part of sort of Eurocentric ways of thinking, because if you pinned it on Christianity, you're pinning it on yourself, right? Europe is Christian in many ways. So it's not that. Rather, you came up, scholars came up with this category of religion that is really talking about Christianity, but it's now subsumed all other religious ways of life from all around the world. So that's where the problem occurs, that there is violence, there is, very difficult problems in how you manage differences, for example. How do you manage deep differences? But what I would say is that there is not a single factor, and I say this after reading hundreds, probably thousands of pages of literature on secularism and European history and other relevant areas. There is not a single factor that distinguishes secular ways of life, or secularism or secularity, from religious ways of life, that can allow someone to say that one is inherently more prone to violence, or one is inherently less susceptible to politics, or less susceptible to harmonious, peaceful life, or dealing with deep difference, or any of that, right? And I'd say that with 100% confidence. Rather, what's happened is you look to examples in the past and you pin things on religion, and you've had to turn a blind eye to the fact that the modern world, the secular world, has same or more amounts of the exact same thing. So, for example, intractable difference. We've already talked about violence, right? Let's put that aside. Talk about difference. Sunni, Shia from Islam, Catholics, Protestants from a Christian perspective, or interreligious, kind of like Christians and Jews can't get along, or Jews and Muslims can't get along. What's happening in the modern world? We've changed them up for communists and liberals and socialists, left and right, nationalists and cosmopolitans. And Europe has gone to war over those things, right? So obviously war is a whole new level, right? But look at the US and the culture wars. Is that getting on very nicely with each other? We love each other. There's a complete breakdown of trust and discussion and discourse, and it's just, speaking past each other. So can that not be seen as intractable deep difference? It can. So it's only, there's definitely a secular prejudice through which secularity and secularism are seen to be inherently and presumptively better than religious forms of life when it comes to organizing society, politics, rationality, science, or any other important aspect of human life.
Yeah, maybe I will break it down, inshallah, once I get a chance to read your thesis in talking about these sort of topics around secularism, because it's a huge topic in of itself. But I guess to shift the discussion towards the activism of, pro-Palestinian people on the ground, what's your take on the level of activism around Palestine, around the world? Are you surprised by the traction this issue has taken? Are you, we see it all over, for example, social media. We see many boycotts are a big thing now. We're seeing people not going to McDonald's. I think there's been an issue or a statement in terms of lost sales or something to that effect that I came across, and Starbucks being boycotted. So there's just been a lot of activism, especially on Instagram as well. It's a bit random, but I know big stars like I think it was Gigi or Bella Hadid. One of them would with Dior, but Dior dropped one of them, and so now they went with the Israeli model or whatever. And now the people jumping on Dior being boycott Dior. And there's all these boycotting movements, which is, I guess, really good to see, because, it's really important that we have an understanding where our products come from and not help, the state of Israel in that regard in an economic sense. But yeah, just curious to get your perspective in terms of that level of degree of activism.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been very encouraging and very pleasant that really the world as a whole, East, West, Muslim world, countries in Asia, South America. Really shout out to the South American nations, where I think they've had the most courage to, recall ambassadors to Israel, cut diplomatic ties. So yeah, and it hasn't just been boycotts, right? You mentioned some great examples of boycotts, but the protests, social media activism, boycotts, so various modalities of activism. We also have to appreciate, I think, the ingenuity of the younger generation and of people to really stand up and make their voice heard. And I think it's important to also acknowledge here that, or not acknowledge, but to appreciate that the reason this particular issue gets so much attention is because it's such an open and shut case. It's such an open and shut case of like clear-cut oppression from one side, and people living in devastating conditions for 75 years on the other. And so I think that over time, now obviously over time that's increased. Palestine generally has had a lot of support, but it has definitely increased over the last 15, 20 years. I think social media plays a part in that. Social media has broken the monopoly of mainstream media. Mainstream media continues to be a mouthpiece for power. But social media has allowed the entry of all sorts of other voices. So yeah, activism I think has been good. We need a lot more of it. And I think we will see a lot more of it. We'll see a lot more ingenuity and different ways of doing things. And that's the best we can do. We don't have power as the masses, but I don't think that should stop us from doing whatever we can. I think that's the point I would emphasize. There is a tendency for people, generally, it's a human kind of reaction to say, well, what can I do as an individual? Whatever action I do is going to be really, really small. It's not going to change things. It's not going to stop the bombing. Of course, I hate the bombing that's happening. I hate the fact that hundreds and now thousands of children are dying. I want to do something, but then people think, whatever I do, if I attend a protest or, make a post on social media, or I put up posters or whatever, that's not going to make a difference. And I think what people really have to think, it's not about your one contribution. The problem is when too many people think like that, nothing happens. Because you think, I'm not going to make a difference, so you don't do anything. But if more people did something, the cumulative effect is what echoes. It's the cumulative effect that amplifies the truth and the voice of the oppressed. And that's what we need more of.
So touching on that, how would you say protests are helpful? Because we see around the world, all around the world, pro-Palestinian protests, people are getting onto the streets, voicing their concerns and chanting, and it's creating that awareness. But what are your thoughts about it, and what other specific recommendations would you do in terms of how laity can go about doing activism?
Yes, I'd say that protests are very helpful and a very important part of grassroots activism. Protests. What are protests? Protests are a way of aggregating and amplifying our voices. I can say what I can speak for the oppressed. I can speak against oppression myself. That's just one voice. I can get together with 5 people and it's a bit stronger. I can get together with 50,000 people and it'll be stronger than that, right? So it's about impact, and larger numbers, and protests allow for those larger numbers, allows for greater impact. So it's great to see, and we have to appreciate there's been very large protests all over the world, and they're increasing. Other forms of protest, look, the forms of activism, the forms of activism are many. And this is where you don't want to give sort of like a list, and you want to leave room for the ingenuity of people. But otherwise, there's various things that can be done in the real world, and there's various things that can be done on social media. And social media is a major front now on the public opinion battle, or the battle for hearts and minds. But yeah, putting up posters, education is very important. Speaking, lectures, whether in real time, in organizing lectures at universities, in other institutions, but also on social media, podcasts, right? So really, it's about in the end, it's about you want to convey a message that speaks for the oppressed, stands against oppression, amplifies key messages. Engages in the narrative war against propaganda. The ways you can do that are numerous. And for example, one of the things that Gen Z has been really good at is memes. Memes, both pictorial and videos, where humor is used to make the point. So these are different styles and means, and I think people need to be creative both in terms of style and in terms of impact. Right. So, for example, one example that I saw online was, someone started a series of posters. So we've seen the kidnapped posters that Zionists are putting up all over the world. I saw a case where there was a website, Murdered by Israel. Posters were designed to humanize the children of Palestine who were being killed for no reason. Now, and it wasn't just that you design posters. That's fairly standard, right? You design posters, you can put them up. But I think the next step was on this website, they had gone open source and said, here's the posters. Anyone can print them out and post them anywhere in the world. And if you actually follow, and then I started seeing online that the same posters were being used in Washington, outside Joe Biden's, I don't think it was the presidential place, or it was his place somewhere, they were sticking them up. I saw them in London. I saw them in Melbourne. I saw a printing organization printing them out freely along with other staff for people to use. So now you see how open source and people working together is so much just amplifies that voice and amplifies the impact. So I think it's ideas like that and many others that people can and should use.
And also, as a result of this activism by the laity, there may be an inevitable situation where we will have to ally ourselves with other groups. Like, for example, when I was at the protest, there was I think it was a pro-Palestinian LGBTQ group, for example. So those badges were being put out, or I think, sorry, it was a LGBTQ, like, those badges they sell? It was like the pro-Palestinian ones because it was a Palestine protest, but then there's all these other ideologies kind of there as well. And you have, I guess, liberals coming on board. So like when you have, I guess, it could be a Sunni Orthodox position of bring back Khilafah, all that kind of conversation, it can maybe be drowned out by certain people feeling that a true democratic process will assist in the liberation of Palestine because that's what Israel don't give to them. I mean, that could be true, not true. You can have debates around that, but I guess that sort of notion of Khilafah in those conversations might be not taken as seriously. So you have these kind of interesting tussles in between in regards to different groups that are involved in the struggle for the Palestinian cause. So what's your take on that? And how we approach alliances? Should we find those people with the same aqidah, for example, and just ally with them, or should we ally with other groups that may not have the that sort of similar theology in our regard?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And this is layered. This is this is not just about Palestine, right? Activism at a human level, at an Islamic level. First of all, there's layers, and second of all, I would say that each issue has to be seen on its merits. So if I'm being active on the Palestine issue, or for the Uyghurs, or for against a war in Iraq somewhere, I think focus has to be on the issue itself, and anyone who supports that issue, people can work together on an issue basis, right? So what that means is, if I'm working, whoever else I'm working with, that doesn't mean I now accept everything they stand for, or that they accept everything I stand for. It doesn't work that way. If we operate on that basis, you couldn't do anything. It would be like your activism would be, a very small number of people, because this is not just about this is not just about alliances with non-Muslim initiatives. The same is true in Islam. Within Islam, Muslims have differences, right? And not only do they have differences on all sorts of topics, they have differences on how activism should be done. So let's think about an example within the Muslim space where some people, like say more Ikhwani inclined people, will generally. So this is outside of moments of crisis, right? So this is like 6 months ago, although the Muslim Ummah is in sort of crisis moment where it's constantly having these things, but let's say outside of moments of heightened crisis like now. So people who are more Ikhwani minded want to engage in the mainstream system. A lot of other people would say, no, we should work outside the system. Okay. Then Palestine happens. What do you do? Then the current scenario happens. What do you do? You're going to say, well, I can't really work with the Ikhwani brothers or with, the Salafis because they do this and the Sufis because they say that, right? I'm just using the Ikhwanis here, but it's the same for everyone, right? So I could say Sufis are, not all of them, but many of them are apolitical and they replace politics for a sort of moralizing and tazkiyah, right? And the Salafis do the same thing, right? So I'm not going to work with them. That doesn't work. I would argue that's an anti-Ummatic approach or a non-Ummatic approach, not anti, it's non-Ummatic approach. And that's not that's not the example we get or the understanding we get from the Quran or the Sunnah. At a Muslim level, and this is and we've seen this now, and this is very, very encouraging and very, very excellent, that Muslims have been willing to put aside those differences and say, we have to come together and work on Palestine. We have to come together and stop this genocide, right? Even though it's very clear that when you go outside the moment of heightened crisis, you're going to go back to those differences, and that's fine. That's how we have to work. It's like, okay, if you believe this is the best way forward, all the best to you. May Allah give you tawfiq, right? I know you're sincere and this is how you operate. This is how I operate, but we have to be able to rise above those differences as and when needed. Okay, and in fact, I would say that shouldn't just be at moments of crisis. We need to come up with a formula where we can be working together, generally speaking. And I think that's very much possible. So anyway, I wanted to show that this is not just about non-Muslims, it's about Muslims as well. But then the same equation and the same formula applies with non-Muslims because at some level, at some layer, Palestine is a human issue, right? Genocide, when genocide happens, this should shake humans as humans, not just as Muslims or as Jews or as Christians or as liberals. It should shake us to the core that within a 2-week period or a 3-week period, 4,000 children can be killed and justified, right? So there are many other non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, liberals, socialists who can see that, and their humanity has not, their conscience has not been killed in the way that it has for others. It's a no-brainer that I should join hands with them to project that voice in that moment, and I should figure out ways, if possible, to push against oppression, generally speaking, as and when possible. But of course, the more the more we go to higher layers, it's going to be hard to have those alliances as a norm. Okay, but definitely within the Muslims, we need to figure that out, and we haven't. We have to also acknowledge that, generally speaking, the Ummah has not yet figured out ways for its different flavors, for its different manahij, to figure out an Ummatic approach to politics and activism, and that contributes to our weakness and leads to these moments of crisis, and why we're kind of always reacting. So anyway, those are a few thoughts on sort of alliance making outside our own silos and chambers.
I think my thoughts are like slowly over time, because of the nature of the world, how it's very globalized and information can travel from one end of the world to another. Slowly but surely, we'll have people of different perspectives in terms of aqidah or like schools of thought. Will be kind of homogenized in a way, in the sense that like we have like I remember doing a conversation with Sheikh Asim Yusuf where he said that because the nature of sheikhs right now is like a person comes to them, asks a question, they give a ruling. It's not necessarily always bound by the school of thought, they kind of have to take into consideration the people. And you know, in the West, you have people from all parts of the world living in the West, so you know they come from a Shafi or a Hanafi background, this and that. But that's kind of maybe irrelevant at points, because you know the sheikh has to kind of address that person and the context and the situation. So it becomes hard to just stick purely to one madhab in that regard. So I guess that example we can take into other things such as politics. Slowly but surely, I hope you know over time we'll see a more unified process. I mean, I guess the situation in like what's happening in Palestine and Gaza, people are uniting over the fact, and people want to know a solution, want to have a solution. I think people are sort of on board with the whole idea of, for the most part, say like armed resistance and Hamas, and they're not shunning it in the way that maybe 20 or 30 years ago, the conversation was a lot different in that regard, right? Like we wouldn't say, I don't know, like we wouldn't say ISIS is a result of the Western powers and their reaction to that. People are quick to just condemn their actions and be like, we're the good Muslims, right? So I think that narrative is slowly shifting, but as a result of the community just being bombarded with, it could be Islamophobia, racism, struggle for our people, especially it could be in the West, but also in places in the Middle East or in Gaza and Palestine, where people are actually dying as a result of the action. Of the
absolutely. I'd just like to add a point here. I think you raised a very good point. If we generalize it a little bit in terms of there's a tension at a theoretical level. There is a tension between truth and politics. Politics, this is generalizing your example from Sheikh Asim about how sheikhs don't always stick to their madhab because practicalities and realities come in the way, if you will. And that's all the more true of politics. Politics, even classically, has not always been about truth. There's a compromise between truth and the realities that we face, right? That doesn't mean it's not tied to truth. It just means that I have to seek for greater and broader truths and make some room for the smaller ones. So, if someone's to use your example, if someone's a Hanafi, for them the truth is the Hanafi madhab, because every particular of that madhab is by assumption true with the possibility of being wrong, and the others, any opposing view is wrong presumptively with the possibility of being right. So the truth is the Hanafi positions. Not only that, within the Hanafi, it's not like the Hanafi madhab is a monolith. Within the Hanafi madhab, there are some differences. So for one scholar, if they take the approach, so let's say they follow Ibn Abidin as a later day verifier, as opposed to some other verifiers, we're getting even more narrow. So literally, you would have to stick to everything that this one scholar says on any issues, right? But that's not how it works. And that's true not just of fiqh, but at a level of politics, is true more generally, that there's a tension between truth and politics, and you have to work with that. And that's how Islamic history has always been. Scholars and leaders in how they operated, and I think we just haven't come up with a formula and a way, an operationalized way to do that well, for many reasons. We're minorities in the West. We're a colonized people in the Muslim world, and we've had our agency taken away. And it's only in recent times that we're reviving and rising to the occasion. So definitely the trajectory is good. The trend is good, as you pointed out. But I think there's a lot of work to be done. But I'm hopeful that we'll work these things out, inshallah, with the tawfiq of Allah.
And I remember I always kind of use this example where you may be familiar as well back in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, like the whole ruling on women going to the masjid. In Bangladesh, people are a lot more stricter with following that ruling in terms of not permitting women to the masjid. That's pretty common in the subcontinent. So it's a very strict Hanafi opinion, according to my knowledge. So I remember asking Sheikh Saleh Basir, as well as I think he's a mufti right now as well, and because he comes from a Deobandi leaning, and he said that in his institution this day and age, like they don't actually follow that ruling, despite it being a very strict ruling in the Hanafi madhab, as a result of the current condition, which you alluded to, like the situation at hand, where, for example, Islamic learning is can be difficult. to get hold of, and getting hold of, knowledgeable people within the community might be a bit difficult. So just inhibiting people not to go to the masjid is going to make it even worse. So as a result of the situation, the climate, and the state of the ummah, especially people living in the West, we should be permitting them to go to the masjid to seek that Islamic knowledge. So he made that caveat that we will follow that ruling as long as Islamic learning is established in the household. But we know the state of the ummah at the moment, it's not necessarily like that. So it's really interesting that it's kind of speaking to that shift in that direction. I think there is that unification in that regard from different schools of thought coming together slowly but surely. But inshallah, it does speed up in that regard, and the conversation gets better, so that we're able to also come together to address these pertinent political situations that we are in as a ummah as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's happening there, just very briefly, is I think it's important to understand, because some people will take that to be, oh, you're moving away from what you believe is right, and you're changing Islam for the reality kind of thing. But that's not what's happening, because the resources that you use in order to do that adjustment are also Islamic, right? So it's not you're saying, oh, Islam says this about women going to the masjid. There's a different opinion on that, right? The different madhabs have different views. And for some scholars, part of the revival has been to go back to the source text and say, hang on a minute, the idea that they shouldn't go to the masjid, or it's discouraged. No one says they're not allowed, by the way. It's about encouragement or discouragement and what's better. But even the idea that this discouraged is wrong because the Prophet said this, and this Quran says this, and so on and so forth, using Islamic resources. But even those who don't do that, like the example you said with Sheikh Saleh, the point is it's looking at greater Islamic purposes and still using the very same resources and the same usul to apply. And that's very, very important to note, because we also have to distinguish a sort of correct way of doing this with modernist approaches, which will just go like, oh, this ruling is wrong, it was old, and the greater purposes of the Sharia are freedom, and come up with some liberal ruling, right? So there are wrong and right ways of doing this, but I think it's important to understand that the right way of doing it is to stay within Islamic usul and Islamic resources, and many, many mashayikh and scholars are doing that.
In the context of tracking back to a discussion about aligning with certain groups, I also wanted to ask, we have a lot of Muslims in Parliament, especially in the UK. I think there's a lot of Muslims in Parliament, not necessarily in the Australian context, but I guess in a worldwide context. And we see, the famous Ilhan Omar from America. We have Muslims that are aligned, I guess in the UK context, they align with the Labour Party because they assume that, they're for the Palestinian cause, but then now they've actually, some of them actually resigned as a result, which is commendable, right? Like, they resigned from the party because they felt like they weren't really speaking for the struggles of the Palestinian people, especially in the current context. So what's your thoughts about just aligning with such, because we talked about aligning with groups, but you also talked about like the levels to it. So aligning with groups through a democratic process as well, which may be argued isn't Islamic in that quote unquote sense, but aligning with such, it could be the Labour Party in order to further the cause, bring these tensions to light, because and then try to do the activism through those means, because essentially I would say that it's, from my own perspective, I think it's a lost case, because at the end of the day, Britain, America, Australia, Israel have shared interests. They're going to fulfill their shared interests, which is, security reasons, and fulfilling that, the state apparatus in that regard, in terms of, keeping those, alliances together and fulfilling their actions accordingly. And so it's sort of a lost cause being, aligning with such groups, because it's never going to triumph the state sort of objectives.
Yeah, I think I would agree broadly with the way that you've passed this issue. When it comes to the Labour Party, I know traditionally Muslim communities, not just in the UK, but in Australia, and probably with Democrats in the US, have kind of aligned more to them for a number of reasons. But we've also seen quite clearly over recent years that when it comes to these issues like Palestine, like foreign policy, there's barely a difference between the Labour Party or the Liberal Party, the Democrats or the Republicans, the Labour or the Conservatives in the US, in the UK. So in that sense, I don't see any point of aligning with one or the other because there's barely a difference. There might be some difference in rhetoric, some difference in policies. In fact, just recently we had a slight controversy with community leadership meeting the Prime Minister, and one of the things that Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, said to these leaders was that, we're actually relatively pro-Palestinian because we've done this, this, and this. We refuse to recognize East Jerusalem or Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in a two-state solution. We still refer to the West Bank as occupied territories and so on and so forth, which is true. But those things, in the larger scheme of things, are like, breadcrumbs or peripheral matters. And so that's what it's become. The difference between the two major parties is increasingly tokenistic, very nominal. And we've seen it now, like Anthony Albanese, the Labour Party. And Anthony Albanese is someone who in the past was pro-Palestinian at a certain point. As Prime Minister in the last month, he has stood behind Israel as much as Joe Biden has in the US, and as much as the Prime Minister of the UK has in the United Kingdom. So, therefore, I don't see a point. Now, that doesn't mean there's no room for tactical engagement in electoral politics otherwise, but I think if it is, it'll have to be tactical in certain areas where certain MPs are taking more, a more fair stance, or maybe denying a certain party your votes because you're going for independence or for the Greens or something like this. I think there's room for that. There's some argument to be made for that, but by and large, I don't see that as a way forward, as a way that can, give us much hope for change. Because, as you said, by and large, the system, it's not just the parties, it's the establishment. The Australian establishment, the UK, the US have shared interests with Israel and deep connections from the very beginning. And so I don't see that aspect changing anytime soon.
And so, we've been pretty much talking about alliances, maybe from the perspective on our community level. Now we talked about on a political party level. Now on a more state level, I was curious about your thoughts on the actual armed resistance on the ground, and alliances with them. So we know Hezbollah, Iran, have been for the Palestinian cause and have been fighting as well in terms of against Israel, opposing Israel, but at the same time, because Hezbollah, Shia-oriented group, they were actually even in Syria, siding with Bashar al-Assad, and then, massacring Sunni Muslims. And so, it becomes these alliances can be very contradictory in nature in that regard and can be difficult to navigate because it's like, look, obviously, if they're helping us and helping Palestinians fight Israelis, it's almost like, because there's no other country in that regard assisting, it's like we're taking as much help as we can get at this point in time. But it's not to say, like, down the line, if another situation pops up and Hezbollah are involved, they may, stab the Sunni Ummah, in the back. And so there's this kind of difficult terrains we have to navigate in terms of alliances. So what's your sort of thoughts about all of that and Hezbollah being involved and siding with the Palestinians? Like, should we take into consideration theological leanings when it comes to these alliances, especially on this sort of level?
Yeah, look, that's another excellent question. But I think much of the same principles that we spoke about in terms of alliances with other activist groups apply here. The principles apply here. For example, the point I made about we can't think. The problem is we tend to think in totalizing terms. What that means is, so I want to come up with one major judgment about Hezbollah, or one major judgment about Iran or Saudi Arabia or Erdogan, and that's it. But it doesn't work that way. Like life is complicated, politics is complicated, the region is complicated. I think we should have an overall sense of where these people are at, but then we have to look at each case on its merits. And in that case, I might support action taken by a particular party because it's the right action in that context, without me being, a card-carrying member or a flag-waving supporter of that group. Why does it have to be, one or the other? It doesn't. So, and again, there's that aspect. Then there's the other aspect of, I think politics needs to be understood on political terms, and you can't draw a straight line from theological differences or sectarian differences to the political ones. I think that's a very dangerous line to draw. So, for example, some people might do this thing where Hezbollah is Shia, Iran is Shia. That's why we can't support them. That's why they're wrong. But hang on a minute. Saudi Arabia is Sunni nominally. Egypt is Sunni. What great work are they doing? If anything, they're worse in the picture of the regional politics than anything that Iran or Hezbollah has done, overall speaking. That doesn't mean Iran has done the wrong thing. They've done plenty of wrong things, and we need to call them out. But it's not because they're Shia. What happens in the region, by and large, and this is a big topic, so we're talking in broad strokes here. What happens by and large, and this is one of the points that Kavanagh makes. Actually, I made this reference earlier about the European wars of religion. A lot of the times, what looks like religious factions fighting because of theological reasons is political actors acting on political agendas and instrumentalizing theological or sectarian differences, right? So I don't look at Iran as the political representative of Shiaism. I look at them as someone who instrumentalizes Shiaism, as instrumentalizes Shia Islam, I should say, for political reasons. Just as, I hasten to add, Saudi Arabia and to a certain extent Egypt and other, Pakistan, instrumentalize Sunni Islam for political agendas. Like, what connection does Saudi Arabia have to Sunni Islam? Nothing. Except that they'll nominally use it, and they'll use it. MBS is falling over himself to normalize with Israel. Is that Sunni Islam? That's not Sunni Islam. That's cheap kufr, non-Islam, right? So I think so. Two points I made there. Each case has to be studied on its own factors as a political issue in terms of the political analysis. And then when we talk about issues, right? Palestine as an issue, Syria as an issue, as a case study, the Uyghurs as a case study, right? Because the same thing is going to happen there. It's not just Sunni Shia. Can we ally with socialists on Palestine, given that when it comes to the Uyghurs and when it comes to Russia or Assad or China, they do these weird ones where they start justifying, ethnic cleansing of the Uyghurs, all right? Or they'll start supporting Russia or something like this. It's the same thing. The case studies should be looked at on their own merits, and individual actors should be looked at in their own merits. We don't have to have a totalizing approach, but that doesn't mean I can't have an overall understanding and an overall view of Iran, of Hezbollah, of Saudi Arabia, of Erdogan. I can have an overall view of Erdogan. I understand Erdogan as, sort of a moderate Islamist, or he could also be a moderate secularist, is kind of both sides of that camp, so the center, who has done some good things. Definitely has facilitated a strong Islamic revival within Turkey on the grassroots, on the ground level. But his politics, there's a lot that's problematic with it as well. So I can have a broad view of Erdogan, but then when it comes to a particular issue, I also need to have some nuance and say, okay, on this issue, how do I look at him? Right? Likewise Hezbollah, likewise everyone else. So I think that's the approach that I would use and that I would encourage anyway.
So you mentioned Saudi and Israel and those ties. Why do you think that we have, Sunni countries as well? Part of the normalization with Israel. Like, I know Jordan are actually, it's really contradictory. Like, I read a news article that said that Jordan is sending aid to Gaza, but then they're also storing all the military equipment and aiding America. So it becomes a bit contradictory. I don't know. I haven't looked into depth in that regard, but the assumption has been that Jordan is also implicitly aiding Israel in that regard. And then
I don't think there's anything contradictory here. So powers or states will have an overall approach, and definitely Jordan is more on the side of Israel than against it. So is the Gulf states, so is Saudi Arabia, most of the states in the region. However, sometimes that the approach that you've taken as part of your political regional calculus is not in line with what your people want. And in order to placate the people and to not go full openly tyrannical, you will take certain tokenistic measures in order to make the claim that you're helping the resistance. So this is how I understand Jordan. Jordan stands more with Israel than against it, but it will provide some aid, it will provide some cover, it will do some of these things. And that's the easy way to say it. Like, look at the things they're doing and see which ones have how much impact, right? And it's a similar case with Saudi Arabia in this case is not really doing anything positive, but nevertheless, although MBS has been strongly pushing for normalization, he's kind of gone quiet on that now to some extent. Although recent reports were saying, that process is going to go ahead, and there have been similar. So basically, a lot of these states have, because the Muslim street, the Middle Eastern street, the North African street, the subcontinental street is vastly pro-Palestine and have strong Islamic sentiments. The rulers need to take that into account, and so they'll provide some tokenistic measures to not come out full in support of Israel. Otherwise, the Muslim rulers are the first, these regimes are the first barrier of support for Israel, and they've always been like that from the inception. Even the so-called wars have not been genuine. And we know that because if you study the matter in its comprehensiveness, that's what you find. They never had, someone like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt when the Six-Day War happened. He's not an Islamist, he's a nationalist, right? But even as a nationalist, he has, and these things came clear later on, he had strong connections with the US. Although at the time he was being shown to be on the side of Russia. Either way, Russia or the US is like two sides of an ugly coin. So, definitely the Muslim rulers are not on our side. However, again, there's some nuance. I wouldn't put someone like Erdogan in the same boat as MBS, even though Erdogan does think like he's facilitating the transfer of oil to Israel, which Israel is using for its war machine, right? So anyway, those are a few particular thoughts, but those are the principles I would use. You need to look at the case studies on their own merit, and you need to look at the actors on its own merits as a general level. But then in each case study, it may be the case that a particular action is welcome, right? So in the current situation with Palestine, action that supports the Palestinians of any type is welcome, including armed struggle, right? Because they're being killed with military means. So to defend them militarily would be a welcome action from anyone in the region, right? And we wouldn't say no because generally that person is otherwise doesn't have a pro-Palestinian stance or supports Israel or whatever the case may be. But because that's the case, you don't expect that to happen. Because these actors are generally not pro-Palestinian, even some of the ones that are rhetorically so, you don't see strong action or significant action or the action that is required at this time given what is taking place in Gaza and now in the West Bank.
So I think in regards to, you had mentioned, like for example, in the context of Jordan and them sending aid, it's more of a show in that regard to the people. is kind of flowing onto what we've seen. We've seen some moving speeches from Erdogan in Turkey, blatantly, if I recall, called Israel a terrorist state, and then called out the atrocities. Like he's going full gung ho in that regard, and it was almost bringing the Muslim world. They saw it as a beacon of light in that regard, but then we haven't seen any movement in terms of Turkish troops going into Israel. But and then people talk about there is that sort of economic ties between Israel, Turkey, or that relationship there as well, which may be the reason as to why Erdogan, like, maybe making those speeches, making it seem like he's obviously pro-Palestinian, but then there's other things happening behind the scenes that is inhibiting him to actually make moves on a political sense or as an armed resistance level or side of things. So, what are your thoughts about that? Like, would you say that Erdogan is just doing it for PR, the speeches that he's done, or and is that the reason? And the reason as to why there hasn't been actual, other countries, not just Turkey, put in or send their armies out in terms of the armed resistance level.
Yeah, look, again, you have to look at it case by case. So I think, I don't expect any of these countries to send their armies, given where they're at and given what they've done. That's both in terms of where their essential allegiances lie, which is not with Islam. I'm talking generally now about most of the regime. So Pakistan, from Pakistan to Saudi to Egypt, across the region. In most of their cases, their allegiances do not lie with Islam and the Muslim in the first place. Their extension, they are manifestations of a colonial legacy and the extensions of neo-colonial power. It's as simple as that. In some cases, it's a bit more complicated, like with Turkey. And I say that because it's clearly, Erdogan has facilitated an Islamic revival. Nevertheless, you have to look at it on the case-by-case merits. Erdogan is not doing enough. It's not because he's not sending his army. That would be a massive action. He hasn't even cut diplomatic ties. He hasn't even stopped the oil trades. And it's not just that Turkey has economic ties with Israel. It also has military ties, military engagements, and at a military level, which is a very strong indictment because Israel is using it's a military occupation. So there's a lot of actions that can be taken short of sending your troops, right? But he's not taking them either. Now, is that because he doesn't care, he can't do it, or because he's genuinely trapped because of regional forces, he doesn't want to expand the thing? Because that has to be taken into account as well. If anyone sends their troops, the battlefield will expand. America will get involved and so on and so forth. Now, should that happen as Muslims, I think we should say yes. Because otherwise it means you're saying it's okay for the people of Gaza to die, it's okay for the kids to be killed, we don't want the conflict to expand. Right? I don't think that's a fair position. That's a fair Islamic moral position to have. But when we have to judge this politically about these various actors in the region, nevertheless you have to consider all these factors to see what's going on. At a broad level, I don't see anyone in the region who stands up to do what is sufficient as per what Islam requires of them in the current situation. That doesn't mean they're all the same, and I always get this. So if I say something about Iran or the Hezbollah, people will attack you and say, "Oh, but Saudi does this." If you say about Saudi, they say, "Oh, but so and so does this." It's not about comparisons. It's not a race. It's about saying that as an ummah, Islam gives us our standards and our reference point, and we need to judge everyone by that standard, right? And even if Erdogan, I would say, is definitely better than MBS, no comparison. That doesn't mean it's a free pass, and whatever Erdogan does, we have to say yes, 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 and I have to support it. No, I can judge and say, well, why isn't he doing this? Why isn't he stopping the oil? Why isn't he recalling ambassador from Tel Aviv and expelling the Israeli ambassador? That's a very small move. Other countries have done that. South American countries have done that. Why can't you do that? Right. So, yeah, those were a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, then how do you envision on a national state level what can be done in order to assist. Because you mentioned, like, okay, let's just say the armies get involved. There's going to be other armies, America and stuff is, it's going to escalate in that regard. So perhaps that's not probably the pragmatic decision to take. So just wanted to get your thoughts about what would you say is the ideal situation in that regard.
Look, the thing is here, the problem here is, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying the Muslim army shouldn't move. In an ideal world, they should move. In the current situation, they should move to defend the defenseless people of Gaza. What I'm saying, however, is the expectation for them to move, I think, is naive. If anyone's expecting, I'm not sure if anyone is expecting that. And so this is what happens whenever we look at a problem and we start thinking about solutions. There's the ideal of what should happen in that situation, and then there's what I expect to happen, and given the real world scenario, what should be the pathway that we should take. And so in the current, to give an example of that, in the current scenario, yeah, I'd love for, the Pakistani army and the Turkish army and the Egyptian army to move. And if they moved, we'd have a very, very clear solution. It'd be very easy, because this idea that Israel is undefeatable and whatnot is nonsense. Even the US is stretched. Even the US getting involved and Europe getting involved, the US is stretched. It's not in the position that it was in the early 90s, for example, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So those are things. But is that going to happen? What's the likelihood of that? I'd say 0.001%. Because the armies, either the countries where the army is in control, like Egypt or Pakistan, and the place where the civil authority is perhaps more in control than the army, like Turkey, nevertheless, these places are not regimes that are thinking ummatically, or they're Islamic regimes, or their allegiances are with the Ummah, and they're just looking at from that prism. They're not. And that's the problem, right? We're in a situation where we don't have, the Muslim Ummah is disempowered. We don't have the power that reflects our interests and our aspirations and our desires, right? So therefore, the pathway becomes for us to work towards that, situation where we do have a genuinely Islamic leadership in Turkey and in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia. That's a long-term thing, and this is where it becomes both sobering, but also, it's a sobering and disappointing realization that we don't have the necessary means in our hands right now to stop children being killed in their hundreds and thousands. But it is what it is. We don't lose hope, because we know Allah is the author of history. Allah is in control. And if this is the situation we're in, there is a wisdom for it. So rather, instead of losing hope, we are a hopeful ummah, and we do what is required of us. And this is where our aqidah and our belief comes into play, because, yes, children are being killed, people are being killed, innocent people in large numbers, but these people are on their way to paradise as martyrs. And us who feel helpless and who feel broken and who feel, emotionally heavy, and I know the Muslims all over the world are feeling this, we know that in the end Allah is just, and He's going to judge us with what was within our ability, not on what was outside our ability. You see, and this is why it's like, although materially and in the world it could be a very depressing situation, it's the vastness of the akhirah, it's the vastness of Allah's justice and the vastness of history that reminds us that as Muslims we are always hopeful. We act with hope, we act with energy and positivity, even when it's difficult. And so that's the approach that we should take. It is a long-term, the solution is long-term. We need to figure ways and act on ways to empower ourselves in our homelands before anywhere else. Empower ourselves in our homelands so that we can act at that level and not be at the behest. The current scenario, and I'll end with this, the current scenario really is what? It's the US is in control, materially speaking. The US is in control. Israel is very strong, stronger than most of the regimes around it. Europe is strong, and they don't care about what happens to you. And so what do? It doesn't mean don't do anything. Yes, you should protest. Yes, you should call them to account. But these are actions to try and minimize their oppression. It's not going to bring about change. The change requires a longer term strategy where you wrest power back for the Ummah in the Muslim world. But I think the learning point for Muslims around the world is everyone has to have a stake in that. Everyone has to have a regular and ongoing stake in that, not just think about that in moments of crisis. If we all had a stake and had a role in that, it would not be such a long-term thing. It would happen in a shorter time span. Wallahu alam, and may Allah give us tawfiq.
I'll wrap up in short in about 5-10, and I really enjoyed your point about optimism, because I think at the end of the day, as a ummah, as Muslims, being in tune with the principles and the things of the Quran, Sunnah, and also the stories we consistently hear, like we know obviously in Battle of Badr, like the situation the Muslims were in, and we still triumphed. And then we have, for example, Surah Al-Kahf in the Quran, like, they were pretty much targeted. They, believed in Allah, and they were victorious in their project in that regard, or their mission. And also, for example, people in the ditch, like they were burnt alive, but they were victorious in the sight of Allah. So we have many examples of that. Even Hunayn, when it looked like we weren't going to win, and Allah sent angels. So we have many instances and situations throughout our tradition that always have that optimistic mindset and always find a way. And inshallah, like in terms of having the exact solutions right here, right now, we should also have that mindset of thinking long term and setting the seeds, and growing them for the next generation to come in and work off it, inshallah. It could be in either front, arms resistance, or in an education front as well. There's many ways to make an impact. So yeah, I don't know if you had any extra thoughts, but also want
I think that's an excellent point. Two things came to mind. One was the fact that in part Zionism was successful because it was strategic and long term. But the other part was, as I'll come to that, but the other part was that you said, I think is more important. This is not the first time in the Ummah's history that it's been disempowered. It's probably, the 20th century is probably the worst time because of various factors, but the Prophet ﷺ was disempowered for the first half of his life. It was just one person in Mecca with some people around him slowly growing and being, tortured and boycotted and all sorts of things. And this is the story of the prophets, many prophets. So as Muslims, it's not as if we don't know, or we think we can never be in this situation of disempowerment and persecution. But what's key is understanding that we don't lose hope. We maintain our fundamentals and we work, and understand that what's important is the work itself. The journey is what's important, not the destination, right? The journey itself. So whether you're disempowered or you're in power doesn't make a difference. There could be people, Muslims, who were disempowered, but in the sight of Allah, their value is greater and their rank is higher than Muslims who were empowered and had the state. Maybe they were in the time of the Ottomans or the Abbasids, the Umayyads, because it's the journey that matters. Nuh alayhi salam, 950 years, disempowered through that entire time period, in the sense that he didn't have power, he wasn't a government, he wasn't a ruler, he was an individual. People rejected him, but he kept going. It's that journey that carries the value and carries the status in the eyes of Allah, and that's what matters in the end. What matters in the end is what Allah thinks, Allah's pleasure, and not anyone else's. So we have to learn from those, and I think this is what's important. This is what's so important for me. As you said, we know the stories, right? We know all the stories of the prophets, of the Sahaba, of the early Muslims, even of pre-Islamic, even of Bani Israel, the good people from Bani Israel, and the early Christians. We know the stories, but a lot of us don't connect those stories beyond, just sort of moral lessons. We're not able to connect them to our political struggle. And that's what's key. We have to connect them to our political struggle and understand and be engaged and do and emulate them, not just get excited about the story and say, wow, that was really, really great. You know, I like to always use the example of, there's many examples, of so many, about like Imam Ahmad, for example, in the Mihna, right? This is a case of, this is in the Khilafah, right? This is the Abbas Khilafah. We're a time of strength for the Muslims, but within it, there are journeys of individuals that are struggles, right? So, and we all know the story of Imam Ahmad. He stood strong. He didn't bow down. He was tortured, and so on and so forth. And we celebrate that. But then when we come to think about how scholars should be today, there's a big wedge. You know, you have a scholar himself telling the story and celebrating it, but you can't see anything in his life that emulates that. So we need to connect those stories and those histories with our political struggle, not just our moral theological struggle. And at the same time, we need to learn and emulate them. The other very quick point that I was going to make was just, I was thinking Zionism was a strategic initiative. It started in the 1880s. It took 70 years, 2050. It took 70 years just to get established, and another 50, 60, and it's ongoing, right? And when it started, you had persecuted individuals in Europe thinking long-term about establishing a homeland in another part of the world. And they had to work hard and they do things. Obviously, the difference, I don't want to use them as models because I think what they didn't have is a moral compass. And therefore, we cannot have them as our role models. But the point we can take is that strategic work is what you need. Strategic vision is what you need. And if others can do it, we can do it better because we do have a moral compass and we have the examples of the prophets and we have the example of the early Muslims and the guidance of the Quran and the Sunnah.
Inshallah, we have that strategic vision, and then we're able to, liberate oppressed Muslims and give strength to the Ummah as well. I don't know if you had any other final thoughts before I wrap up.
No, I think that's a very good note to end on. In fact, it's never lose hope. Connect with Islam, connect with the Quran and the Sunnah, but let us also connect these with our political struggle in a hopeful and active way. Okay, so it's one thing to have hope and just go, I'm having hope and I'm waiting for others to do things. No. Own the struggle. Own the struggle. Take ownership. Take responsibility. Every single Muslim can do something. I gave a talk recently at a masjid, and the point I was made was no Muslim can tell me you can't do anything. Even the grandmother or the grandfather who's 70 years old can do something. And you don't have to go to the protests if you can't. You don't have to be putting up posters. You can be educating your 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds in the home and telling them the stories of our people. Tell them about Palestine. Tell them about our struggles in the subcontinent and in the Middle East and North Africa. You know what I mean? Isn't that what grandparents do? Grandparents tell stories. Let them tell the stories of our people and our ummah, right? Through that Islamic lens. I just use the grandparents because that's what people might think, oh, what can they do? Right? So it's like an extreme example. But my point is every single person can do something. It's about ownership, taking responsibility, and doing what is within your means with hope and with a positive attitude. And of course, whilst connecting and reconnecting always with Allah and getting our fundamentals of our deen correct and right. And that's obviously that's always an ongoing process. And that's all that Allah wants from us, to do what is within our capabilities sincerely and diligently. May Allah give us tawfiq to do so.
Ameen. And inshallah, we also create the awareness religiously and the political situation on the ground so that we can foster that community Ummatic spirit. I know that the initiative that you're part of, the Ummatics project as well, is tailored to that sort of. Would you be able to shed light a bit before I wrap up as well? Because I know you've been part of it for some time.
Yeah, I think that's probably for another conversation, because there's a whole thing that what I would just say is that the Ummatics initiative is one example, one initiative that is trying to do what I just explained. Think strategically, think long-term, have a vision, have a strategy, and work with positivity, with full hope in Allah, and with clear vision that we can achieve everything that we want to achieve. There's nothing that's too outside our range. But yeah, and we don't claim to be the only way, the saved path, the saved sect, anything like that. It's one approach, one way, very transparent, very wanting feedback from the Ummah, and wanting others to establish their own initiatives of that nature, of that type and of different types. Because I really think what we need is not, I think what we've tried in the past is mega organizations, mega global structures that are going to show the way for everyone. And I think that's failed. What we really need in the 21st century is multiple decentralized efforts. I think they are far more impactful and far better because they can speak to local realities, they can adjust for local realities, whilst also having a common global, Ummatic core, let's say, Islamic core. But yeah, I think that's a conversation for another time because we've gone for like 2.5 hours almost. It's been a fascinating discussion. Maybe in another setting we can talk in a lot more detail about the Ummatics initiative.
Yeah, for sure. But I appreciate your time. Appreciate you, unpacking all these important discussions and things that needed to be addressed, especially in the current situation. The people of Palestine and people of Gaza are in, especially on an Ummatic level. It's really important to discuss all these topics. But appreciate your time, Uthman.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the platform, and we need more of these conversations.
Inshallah. So for our special guest, Uthman, you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We're in a bit dormant, but inshallah, with your support, feel free to hop on to our socials and give us a like and share our content as well, inshallah. So for our special guest, Uthman, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.